Okay, everybody, so today we're going to make pie crust, and I'm going to show you how to do that. I have my dry ingredients mixed together in here. It is 2.5 cups of just regular flour and a teaspoon of salt. And then to make sure that they're all mixed together, I use my whisk. And this bowl over here, I have butter. It's been cubed up pretty small. It's 2 sticks of butter. If you don't want to use butter, you can use shortening or you can use a mixture of both. But I'm going to use this. So I'm just going to dump my butter into there and I'm going to kind of toss it around to make sure that it's coated with my flour, my 2.5 cups of flour, and my 1 teaspoon of salt. And when you coat the butter and the flour, it helps to make sure that it's easier for you to cut in with your pastry blender. So this is a pastry blender. If you guys don't have one of these, you can just use a fork to cut it in. So I'm going to cut this in until it looks like crumbs or like long flakes, and then I'll show you guys what that should look like. Okay, so your flour and butter mixture, after you cut it in with your pastry blender, should look something like that. You should have some coarse crumbs in there about the size of peas. It's not going to be even at all, and it shouldn't be. One thing that you guys need to make sure of with your crust is that your butter is really cold. You don't want to have soft butter. If you do, your pie crust is just going to end up just melting all together. It's not going to be flaky. So that is not the texture that we're looking for with pie crust. Another thing you want to make sure is you have ice cold water. So I have quite a bit of water in here. I'm definitely not going to use all of this. And ice. And it just depends with the type of flour you have and like the humidity in the air, how much water you're actually going to need. So for this recipe, you're going to need anywhere from 4 to 8 tablespoons of water. So you're going to make sure that your tablespoon is full. And I'm just going to kind of sprinkle it around in there. And after every tablespoon, I'm just going to toss it around with my fork. Once you guys start adding the water, then you need to be careful how much you're actually handling the dough. Because once you add the water, it adds gluten. And unlike bread, we don't really want a lot of gluten forming with pie crust. You want as little as possible because we don't want the pie crust to be stretchy and tough, which is what will end up happening if you overwork your dough or you handle it too much or it starts to get warm while you're mixing it together. Okay, so how do you know when you have enough water? Well, you should be able to take a chunk of your pie dough and squeeze it in your hand and it should stick together. And if it doesn't do that, then you don't have enough. And you're gonna have to keep adding more. Okay, so right now I'm at 4 tablespoons and I can tell that this is not ready yet. So I'm gonna add a couple more tablespoons. Notice I haven't used my hands yet because that's gonna warm up my butter and I don't wanna do that. You want everything as cold as possible to give you that flaky crust, right? So your fat is coated in flour, or it should be. And what that's going to do is as the butter melts when it's baking, it's going to leave an air pocket where that butter was, and that's what's going to create the flaky texture in your pie crust. So I'm up to 6 tablespoons now. And we're going to see how we're doing. You can see it's starting to come together a little bit more, but not completely, and it won't until you start using your hands. Okay, so it's still crumbly. So this is not ready yet. It needs a couple more tablespoons. And I usually need to end up adding the higher end of tablespoons when I'm making pie crust. If you guys do decide to use shortening in your pie crust, it is a lot easier to work with than butter, just because it has a higher melting point, and so it's less likely to melt while you're trying to form it into a dough. So you have it's less likely that you're going to end up having more gluten formation with shortening. Okay, it's still flaking apart. I'm going to add probably one more 1 or 2 more tablespoons of water. So I've gone over the amount that I originally told you guys, but that's fine, because if your pie crust isn't sticking together with the amount of water you've put in, then you're not going to be able to roll it out and have it stay together. All right. Okay, that's much better. See how it's not really falling apart like it was before, but it's also not stretchy like it was when we made bread. So I'm gonna get this all together into a ball, and this is enough for a top and a bottom crust. So once I get it together in a ball, I'm gonna split it in two, and then I'm going to wrap both sides in plastic wrap and refrigerate it for about an hour just to make sure it's really cold before I roll it out. Okay, so I formed my dough ball, and I split it apart already. So what you want to do is form each piece into a disc. So don't be afraid to touch your dough. You're gonna have to actually, like kind of push it together and squeeze it together to get it to stick. But you want to make sure that you're not over handling it. So it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be cracks in it, and that's fine. But remember that whenever you are rolling something out, that you kind of want to start with the shape you want to end in. So if I start with a circular shape, it's going to be easier for me to end up with one. All right, so it should look about like that. And all you're going to do is you're going to take your plastic wrap, you're going to wrap your pie crust in that plastic wrap. And after it's in the plastic wrap, you could even smush it down some more. And then it's just going to be like that. You're going to stick it in your refrigerator for about an hour or even longer if you want. And then you're going to roll it out, and I'll show you guys how to do that. Pie crust, if you freeze it correctly, if you wrap it in plastic wrap and put it in a freezer bag, can last for up to 3 months in your freezer. So you always have the option to make pie crust ahead of time. It's actually something you probably want to do, because then you know that it's cold and it will be ready for you to roll out. Okay, so we're gonna make apple pie, and I wanna show you guys how to peel your apple and slice it up. You're gonna want thin slices, but not too thin. If they are too thin, then when you're baking it, because it does have to bake for an hour or more in the oven, it's gonna get mushy, and you're gonna end up with like applesauce inside your pie, and you don't want that. So I'm gonna use a paring knife, which is just a small, sharp knife. If you don't have one of these at home, try to find another small sharp knife to use. And I know a lot of people like to use vegetable peelers too to peel their apples. So I'm just gonna try to slice off, as thin as I can to not get rid of my apples. Just get rid of the peel and not the apple itself. And I'm going to cut the bad spots off of this apple when I'm done. So for apples, typically we like to use a crisp type of apple. Like a lot of people like to use Granny Smith, which are the super green apples that you buy at the grocery store. But any crisp apple will work. I don't really like using Granny Smith because they're pretty tart, and I don't like that. Okay, so here's my peeled apple. There's a little bit of peel still on it, but that's fine. You're not going to be able to tell it's there when you eat the pie. Okay, and I've cut the bad parts off. So I'm going to just slice it thinly, going around. And you're going to want about 7 to 8 apples. So it's about 4 to 5 cups. And it's always better to have more than less, because if you have extra apples, it won't fit into your pie crust. You can always eat them. All right, so you want them thin, but not too thin. And we're going to stop when we get to the core, because we don't want the hard part of the core getting into our pie. Okay, so they should look about like that. And you're just going to put them in your bowl. And then we're going to add the rest of the filling ingredients. So I'll talk to you guys about that when we get there. All right, so I have my apples sliced up right here. And now I'm going to add the rest of the ingredients. So I'm going to add brown sugar, a mixture of brown sugar and white sugar. And, but that's totally up to you guys. You could use all white sugar. The recipe actually calls for all white sugar, but I want to use brown sugar too because I like the way it tastes. So I'm going to use 3/4 cup of each for a total of 1.5 cups. So you guys might think that seems like a lot, and to some people it is. So if you don't like super sweet apple pie or you like it kind of tart, then this would probably be too much sugar for you. So you should add at least 3/4 of a cup, however. Okay, remember when you measure brown sugar, you need to pack it in and level it off. Put that in there. We're also going to add cinnamon, a teaspoon of cinnamon. And that's just because cinnamon and apples are really good together. We are going to add a little bit of vanilla for that flavor. We're going to do a teaspoon of that also. We're going to add just about 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And then we're going to add a couple tablespoons of lemon juice. So what the lemon juice is going to do is it's going to help keep your apples from browning too much because it has that citric acid in it, which helps prevent browning because your apples are going to be sitting out for a little while so that the sugar can, like mix in with the apples and it helps to make them juicier and so that they can absorb the flavor. If you don't let them sit, then you're not going to end up with as flavorful of apple pie. So just 2 tablespoons of that. And then I'm going to mix it up and we are going to add cornstarch to it. So cornstarch is what I like to call a filler. That's what it's called. Or I'm sorry, a thickener. And thickeners are going to help keep the inside of your pie from being too juicy. So it's going to help soak up some of that juice so that you don't end up with a runny mess. So I'm going to use cornstarch for this. Another thing you could use for apple pie is flour. If you use flour, you're going to use a little bit more. So this is going to get about 1/4 of a cup of cornstarch. If you were to use flour, it'd get more. It doesn't really matter which one you use for apple pie because the inside is going to be cloudy looking anyway from the apples. However, if you're making a berry pie, you would probably want to use cornstarch because that ends up being clear once it's mixed in with your filling, whereas the flour would make your berry filling somewhat cloudy. Okay, so I'm gonna add the cornstarch and I'll show you guys what that should look like. So this is what your mixture should look. Something like this. Yours might end up being a little bit lighter if you're just using white sugar instead of a mixture of white sugar and brown sugar. But as you guys let this sit, you're gonna see that once you go to put it into your pie crust, into the bottom pie crust, that there's quite a bit of juice. And that's totally fine. Go ahead, put it in your pie crust because that cornstarch or the flour, whatever thickener that you've used, is going to help thicken up the juice and so it won't be like a soupy mess when you cut into it. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys how to roll out your pie crust. And you should be able to see some chunks of butter in it. I don't know if you guys can see that. There's one. But that's what it should look like. So remember, this is going to end up being a flaky crust. Because we have those larger chunks of butter in there. And flaky crusts are good for pies that are not too juicy. The flaky crusts are not as sturdy as other crusts. So another type of crust that you'll see a lot of is something called a mealy crust. Uses the same exact ingredients, except you're going to cut your fat into your flour more. So you're going to end up with really small pieces of fat coated in flour. And that's going to give you a sturdier crust, which is good for like berry pies that tend to be juicier. Okay, so before you start, you're going to want to make sure that you generously dust your counter, your tabletop, whatever you guys are using. because this has a tendency to stick. And we want to work it as little as possible, remember, because we don't want to overwork it and get that gluten. I'm just going to push it out a little bit more into a disc. And I'm going to go ahead and coat the top of it. I even like to coat my rolling pin in flour just to keep it from sticking to it too much. Okay, and this is a little bit messy, and that's fine. So you want to make sure that you keep picking up and turning your pie crust as you go, which is going to help it from sticking to your counter or your tabletop. And it's also going to help to make sure that you can keep those ends together and they're not cracking apart. Okay, this is something you need to be gentle with. And remember, your aim is to have a circle. And it should be bigger than your pie pan, which is probably like 8 or 9 inches. So you want to end up with about a 12-inch circle so it fits in your pie pan the right way. Okay, so as I roll it out, I can really see those chunks of butter in there, and that's going to help give us that flaky texture that we're looking for in the pie crust. It's starting to stick a little bit to my table, so I'm going to stop and very gently take it off of there. Don't be afraid to use flour, you guys. I'm going to flip it, and I'm trying to work those ends back together because we want to not really have too many cracks because then it'll just fall apart in my pan. So this is something you need to be gentle with. A mealy pie crust would also work with apple pie. It's basically just a personal preference. I like flaky pie crust. Okay, so this is about a good size, and I know that because I take my pie pan and you turn it over on it, and you should have at least an inch all around it, and that's how you know it's going to fit into your pie pan right without being too short. So an easy way to move pie crust, because it is very delicate, is just to roll it onto your rolling pin. And go ahead and you're going to brush off your excess flour too while you do that. If you have a pastry brush, that works really well at this point. And if you don't, you can just do this. Go ahead and get that extra flour off there because it's just going to dry your crust out. Another way you could do this is fold your crust in half and then in half again and move it like that. You don't want to pick up the crust and have it just hanging though, because then it will fall apart. Okay, so I'm going to take my pie pan, whoops, and then there's always things like that that happen. So I'm just going to do that. If I would have not talked so much to you guys, I would have had it done right. Okay, so then you're going to just push it into the sides, and then you're going to take your filling and dump it in there, and then you're going to roll out your top crust. This is actually going to go into the refrigerator because we want to keep our crust cold while we roll out our second crust. Okay, so I want to show you guys the filling because now it's gotten pretty juicy. And I just want to show you guys what that one looks like. So see all that juice in the bottom there? That is all going to go into our pie and it'll make it taste good. So we're gonna go ahead and just dump it into the pie pan and try to make it as even as possible. And you really don't want to go any higher than your pie pan with the apples. So I ended up having a little bit extra. but I do want to use all that juice. I'm going to dump the rest of my juice in there. Okay, so I'm going to take my other pie crust, and it's on my rolling pin. Hopefully I can do this right this time. I'm just going to go ahead and roll it right onto my pie. So I have quite a bit of overlap, so I'm going to need to trim the edges. There should not be more than about 1 inch to a half an inch around the edges, and then I'll show you guys how to crimp it. Another option at this point would be not to put it on whole, but to cut it into slices and then make a lattice top. So I will put a video on to show you guys how to do that. But for this one, I'm just going to put a whole pie crust on. All right, one more thing that I forgot to tell you guys, and this is optional, but I like to do it. I have 2 tablespoons of butter, so I just chunked it up, and I'm going to dot the inside of my pie with it, and that's just going to help give it some more flavor while it's baking. We'll put those in there just randomly, and then I'm going to crimp my edges. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So all you're going to do is, oh, there's Bob. This is my dog. He's always wants to be in videos. All right, so I'm just going to take my 2 edges, my top and my bottom, and I'm going to fold them together. Just fold them under like that, all the way around your pie. Make sure that they're sealed together. This is going to help keep all of your filling in there and keep it from escaping into the pan. And then you can do whatever you want to finish this off. So some people like to press it together with a fork. Some people like to use their fingers to go around and make a nice edge. It's whatever you want. Okay, I usually just go around with my fingers. So I take my 2 fingers and I squish the 2 together, and it ends up making a nice edge that I like. Another thing you can do is kind of like push them together like this, and that makes a different look. But then also people like to use the 2 forks, like I said. So you're also going to need to go around and just cut some slits on the top of your pie with whatever butter knife. You could use a fork and go around and poke holes all through it. This is so that as it bakes, the steam has somewhere to vent out of. So if it doesn't, you could end up with a big mess on your hands or just a crust that does not stay down on top of the pie. All right, some people like to get fancy and do designs with their knife slashes, so whatever you like. My finishing touch, and this is optional, but it does help the crust look better and taste better when it's done, is I'm going to brush it with egg wash. So this is 1 egg and then just a little bit of water mixed together, and I'm just going to brush it over my pie, and that's going to help give it a nice golden brown color and a really nice extra flaky texture when it's done. And then after that, I'm going to sprinkle some cinnamon sugar on it, and I'm going to put it in the oven at 425 degrees for 15 minutes. And then after 15 minutes, I'm going to turn it down to 375 and bake it for another about 45 minutes. So how will you know when your pie is done? Well, if you have a glass pie pan like I do, you're going to be able to see down in here, your pie crust should be getting golden brown. You should also be able to see maybe some bubbles start coming out of where you poked your holes for your venting. And that's going to tell you that your crust or the filling is warm and cooking on the inside. Another way to do it is get an instant read thermometer, and the inside of your pie should be 190 degrees. Okay, so, and your crust also should be golden brown, the top of it. If it's still looking pretty pasty, it's probably not done. And if you're having trouble with your crust getting burnt, like the edges, before the inside of the pie is done, you can get some aluminum foil and just fold it down and put it around the edges. And that's going to keep your pie crust from baking too much. So this is a cinnamon sugar mixture I have. Just going to sprinkle it over top. This is optional. You could just use regular sugar. You could use larger sugar crystals to put on top. I just like the flavor that it gives it and the color that it gives it at the end. So that's it. Your pie is ready to go in the oven. So I hope you guys have a chance to make a pie. I wish we could have done this together in class because I really like to show you guys how to make your own pie crust because it's something that um, a lot of people are kind of hesitant to do, but it's not that hard when you take your time. Okay, so good luck, guys.